Hey everyone, and welcome back to your daily digest of the top stories from Hacker News. I'm your host, and today we're diving into yesterday's most heated discussions from the front page. Out of 30 stories that hit the site, we've pulled the 5 that really got the community fired up. And let me tell you, yesterday was intense. We've got the EU trying to break encryption in the name of child safety, Microsoft getting caught powering mass surveillance, private equity firms literally increasing death rates in hospitals, and, in slightly lighter news, though still controversial, Cloudflare jumping into the email game, and yet another browser promising to save us from big tech. These stories perfectly capture the tension we're all feeling in tech right now, between innovation and surveillance, between profit and ethics, between convenience and control. So buckle up, because we're about to dive deep into what had over 3,000 Hacker News users furiously typing yesterday. Let's start with the story that had everyone sounding the alarm bells. All right, moving into something that's got the tech community absolutely fired up. The EU is pushing forward with something called ChatControl. And folks, this is a big deal. This proposed regulation would essentially require every messaging platform, and I mean every single one, including your encrypted apps like Signal, WhatsApp, and Telegram, to automatically scan all private messages and images for child abuse material. Now, I know what you're thinking. Wait, how can you scan encrypted messages without, well, breaking the encryption? And that's exactly the problem that has over 1,000 people on Hacker News up in arms about this. We're talking about 570 comments worth of heated discussion, and let me tell you, the community is not happy. So here's what the EU is proposing: mandatory, automatic scanning of every private message and image sent by 450 million Europeans. No opt-out, no exceptions for regular citizens, though interestingly enough, EU politicians have explicitly carved out an exemption for themselves, which tells you something right there. This isn't just some guideline or recommendation. This would be, as they put it, the strongest and most binding legal instrument in EU law. It would literally override constitutional privacy protections that exist in member states. The technical impossibility here is just staggering. You cannot have end-to-end encryption and also scan the contents of messages. It's like saying you want a locked safe that only you can open, but also the government needs to be able to check what's inside whenever they want. The only way to make this work is through client-side scanning, basically putting surveillance software directly on your device, or creating backdoors in the encryption itself. Either way, you're fundamentally breaking the promise of secure private communication. And look, nobody wants to be the person arguing against child safety measures. That's the insidious part of this whole thing. They've wrapped mass surveillance in the flag of protecting children, which makes it politically radioactive to oppose. But the Hacker News community is seeing right through this. One commenter pointed out the obvious: actual predators will just switch to using GPG or other encryption tools that exist outside these platforms. Meanwhile, regular parents sharing innocent bath time photos of their kids could get flagged by automated systems. The discussion thread is fascinating because you can feel the frustration and alarm. People are drawing parallels to authoritarian surveillance states, and they're not being hyperbolic about it. Several commenters pointed out that once you build this infrastructure, once you normalize the idea that the government can scan all private communications, well, mission creep is inevitable. Today, it's child abuse material. Tomorrow, it's extremist content. Next week, it's political dissent. There was one interesting contrarian view in the mix, though. A user named Nick Wong shared their experience walking around China, feeling what they described as absolute peace of mind because of their surveillance there. They weren't endorsing it exactly, but they were suggesting that as future technological threats evolve, maybe bioweapons, maybe other existential risks, the calculus on surveillance versus safety might shift. It's a perspective that, honestly, most of the community found pretty alarming. What really gets me about this whole situation is the fundamental dishonesty of it. If this was really about protecting children, why exclude politicians from the scanning? Why not focus on the platforms where abuse material is actually shared, rather than casting this impossibly wide net? The community consensus seems to be that this is about control and power, dressed up in the language of child protection. The technical community is particularly outraged because they understand what's at stake here. This isn't just about privacy in some abstract sense. It's about the fundamental architecture of the internet and digital communication. Once you break encryption for one purpose, you've broken it for all purposes. There's no such thing as a backdoor that only good guys can use. Every security expert has been saying this for decades. And yet, here we are, watching the EU seriously consider mandating the impossible. And the timing. We're living in an era where secure communication has never been more important. Journalists needed to protect sources. Activists needed to organize. Businesses needed to protect trade secrets. And yes, regular people needed to have private conversations without worrying about who might be listening. To undermine all of that in the name of a measure that experts agree won't even effectively address the problem it claims to solve, it's beyond frustrating. The Hacker News community is treating this as a five-alarm fire, and honestly, they're right to. This isn't some theoretical future threat. The EU is actively pushing this forward right now. If you're in Europe, or if you communicate with anyone in Europe, this affects you directly. And given how these things tend to spread, if the EU implements this, how long before other governments start demanding the same capabilities? Speaking of surveillance infrastructure being misused, that brings us to our next story, where we see exactly what happens when tech companies provide these capabilities to governments. All right, so our next story is about Microsoft blocking Israel's use of its tech in mass surveillance of Palestinians. And wow, this one really blew up on Hacker News, with over 800 points and more than 700 comments. This is one of those stories where the tech world collides head-on with geopolitics and ethics, and honestly, the timing of Microsoft's response here is raising a lot of eyebrows. So here's what happened. The Guardian ran this investigation that revealed Israel's Unit 8200, which is basically their NSA, their elite signals intelligence agency, had been using Microsoft Azure to store and process surveillance data. And we're not talking about a few suspicious phone calls here and there. This was millions of Palestinian civilian phone calls being collected daily from Gaza and the West Bank. The scale is just staggering. We're talking about 11.5 petabytes of data. To put that in perspective, that's enough storage for roughly 2.3 billion hours of phone conversations. What's particularly interesting is how this relationship even started. Back in 2021, Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella actually met with Unit 8200's commander at the time, Yossi Sariel, and that's when this partnership began. So this wasn't some rogue operation or a case of Azure being used without Microsoft's knowledge. There were meetings, there were handshakes, there was a relationship here. But here's where it gets really contentious. Microsoft only terminated Unit 8200's access after The Guardian exposed everything. They ordered what they called an urgent external inquiry and found terms of service violations. But come on, you're telling me nobody at Microsoft knew what 11.5 petabytes of military surveillance data was being used for? The Hacker News community is absolutely not buying it. And honestly, neither am I. The discussion thread is fascinating because it reveals this deep split in how people think about cloud providers and their responsibilities. You've got one camp saying Microsoft did the right thing, even if it was late. But the overwhelming sentiment is that this is pure theater, Microsoft acting only when caught with their hand in the cookie jar. One commenter pointed out that they're still maintaining broader commercial relationships with the Israeli military, so this feels more like cutting off one tentacle while the octopus stays intact. There's this really thought-provoking debate happening about whether cloud providers should be neutral, like common carriers. One user, eFits, made this compelling argument that I keep thinking about. They're saying that if we celebrate Microsoft making these moral decisions today, what happens when the political winds shift and they start making decisions we don't agree with? They brought up the Parler AWS situation. Remember when Amazon kicked Parler off their servers? Whether you agreed with that or not, it set a precedent that cloud providers can and will make content decisions. And then there's this contrarian view that really made me pause. A commenter named B-Array argued that removing surveillance capabilities might actually lead to more civilian casualties, not fewer. Their logic is that without surveillance, military operations become less precise, more indiscriminate. Now, I'm not saying I agree with that, but it does complicate the simple narrative of surveillance bad, stopping surveillance good. What really strikes me about this whole situation is the willful ignorance angle. Microsoft has all these privacy commitments, these ethical AI principles, these human rights statements, but somehow they missed that a major military intelligence unit was using their platform for mass surveillance. It's like they deliberately avoided looking too closely because, well, government contracts are lucrative. The plausible deniability game is strong here. The technical side of this is wild too. Think about the infrastructure required to process millions of phone calls daily. We're talking about serious computational power, storage, probably some machine learning for voice recognition and analysis. Azure was essentially powering a surveillance state apparatus, and Microsoft's position is simply, we had no idea what they were doing with all that compute power we sold them. You know what this really reminds me of? It's like the old IBM and the Holocaust controversy, where IBM's punch card systems were used by Nazi Germany. Tech companies have always had this uncomfortable relationship with power, selling supposedly neutral tools that get used for very non-neutral purposes. And every time there's this dance of, we didn't know, or we're just providing infrastructure. The community reaction on Hacker News is particularly intense because a lot of these folks work for or with these big tech companies. They're grappling with their own complicity in these systems. There's this underlying question of, if you work on Azure or AWS or Google Cloud, are you partially responsible for how governments use these platforms? It's the kind of ethical question that keeps engineers up at night. What's also interesting is that this story broke right as the tech industry is having broader conversations about AI ethics and responsible technology. Microsoft positions itself as a leader in responsible AI, but then this. The cognitive dissonance is real. How do you square "we're committed to human rights" with "we helped store mass surveillance data until a newspaper called us out"? The timing here is everything. Microsoft didn't discover these violations through their own monitoring. They didn't have a change of heart. They got caught, and then they acted. And even then, the action feels minimal. They cut off one unit while maintaining other relationships. It's damage control dressed up as ethical leadership. This whole situation really crystallizes the challenge of big tech's role in the modern world. These companies have become so essential to infrastructure, both civilian and military, that they can't really claim to be neutral anymore. When you're providing the backbone for surveillance, for military operations, for government services, you're not just a tech company anymore. You're a geopolitical actor, whether you want to be or not. And speaking of profit motives overriding ethics, wait until you hear what's happening when private equity firms take over hospitals. All right, now we're diving into something that's genuinely disturbing. Death rates rose in hospital ERs after private equity firms took over. This one's got the Hacker News community absolutely fired up with over 700 points and nearly 500 comments. And honestly, once you hear the numbers, you'll understand why. So here's what happened. Researchers just published this massive study in the Annals of Internal Medicine where they looked at over 7 million Medicare patient visits across more than a decade. And what they found is that when private equity firms buy hospitals, people literally start dying at higher rates in the emergency rooms. We're talking about a 13% increase in mortality compared to similar hospitals that weren't acquired. It's not subtle either. This is a significant, statistically robust finding. The mechanism behind this is exactly what you'd probably guess if you're cynical about profit-driven healthcare. These private equity firms come in and they immediately start cutting costs, but not in smart, efficiency-improving ways. They're literally gutting the staff. The study found full-time hospital employees dropped by almost 12% after acquisition. And where do they cut the deepest? Emergency departments saw salary expenditures drop by 18%, ICUs by 16%. These are the exact places where having enough skilled people can mean the difference between life and death. What's fascinating, and by fascinating I mean horrifying, is how the Hacker News discussion really expanded on this. Multiple commenters brought up other studies showing this isn't isolated to ERs. There's apparently research showing an 11% mortality increase in private equity-owned nursing homes, too. It's like there's this pattern where PE firms apply the same playbook everywhere: acquire, strip resources, extract profit, and people die. One commenter really nailed the fundamental problem here. They described it as this unholy combination of restricted competition, profit-driven actors, and regulatory capture. Because think about it, in a normal market, if your product kills people at a 13% higher rate, you go out of business. But healthcare doesn't work that way. When you're having a heart attack, you don't shop around. You go to the nearest ER and hope for the best. There was this one comment that really stuck with me about how PE firms are replacing actual physicians with nurse practitioners and physician assistants. Now, NPs and PAs are great, they're essential to healthcare, but they have about 4 years less training than doctors. And when you're systematically replacing the most experienced, most trained staff with less trained alternatives purely to save money, well, the results speak for themselves. Now, there was some pushback in the comments because this is Hacker News after all. One user actually argued that maximizing profit is by definition the greatest good for the greatest people, which, wow, that's a take. They got absolutely roasted in the replies, with people pointing out that this libertarian fantasy completely falls apart when actual human lives are on the line. Another interesting counterpoint someone raised was whether the death rates might be misleading due to patient selection bias. Like, maybe healthier patients started avoiding PE-owned hospitals, leaving only the sicker patients who then had worse outcomes. It's a fair statistical question, but given how the researchers matched hospitals and controlled for variables, it seems like they accounted for this. What really comes through in the discussion is the sense of, resignation mixed with rage. People are sharing stories about how healthcare executives are making millions while nurses are being worked to the bone, how hospitals are being run like Amazon warehouses where everything's about metrics and efficiency, except the metric that actually matters: keeping people alive. One commenter put it perfectly. These PE firms treat hospitals like they're manufacturing plants that just happen to work on humans instead of widgets. They apply the same bleed-it-dry business model they'd use on a retail chain or a software company: extract maximum value, load it with debt, cut everything that doesn't immediately generate revenue, and if it collapses, well, they've already made their money.
The really dark part is that this isn't happening in secret. We have the data. We have the studies. We know people are dying, and yet it keeps happening. The regulatory capture is so complete that even with evidence of increased mortality, these acquisitions continue. It's like we're watching a slow-motion disaster where the profit motive has completely overwhelmed any sense of medical ethics or basic human decency. And you know what's wild? This story sits at the intersection of everything we talk about in tech: data analysis, systemic optimization, market dynamics, except instead of optimizing ad clicks or API response times, we're talking about optimizing profit extraction from human suffering. It's capitalism's algorithm applied to healthcare, and the output is a 13% increase in dead patients. Makes you think twice about the whole move fast and break things ethos when the things being broken are actual people. All right, let's shift gears to something a bit less life and death, but still contentious in the tech world. All right, so our next story is about Cloudflare's new email sending service that just hit private beta, and wow, did this one get people talking. Over 600 points and nearly 500 comments on Hacker News. You know what's fascinating? Here we are in 2025, and email, this ancient protocol from the dawn of the internet, is somehow still causing developers headaches and finding completely new life at the same time. So here's the deal. Cloudflare is basically saying, hey, we know email is a pain, let us handle it for you. They're launching this email sending service that plugs right into their Workers platform. And when I say plugs right in, I mean it's literally just a few lines of code. You add a binding, call a send function, and boom, you're sending emails. No messing around with SMTP servers, no configuring ports, none of that traditional email infrastructure nightmare. What's interesting is this isn't Cloudflare trying to replace Gmail or anything like that. This is specifically for transactional emails. You know, the stuff that keeps your app running. Password resets, order confirmations, those welcome to our service emails that nobody reads but everyone expects. It's more like SendGrid or Mailgun, but with that classic Cloudflare twist of being deeply integrated into their existing platform. And here's where it gets really interesting. They're positioning this as part of something bigger called Cloudflare Email Service, which combines this new sending capability with their existing email routing product. The vision is basically a unified developer experience for everything email related. One platform, one set of APIs, one billing relationship.
Now, the Hacker News crowd had some, let's say, mixed feelings about this. There was actually a lot of initial confusion where people thought Cloudflare was launching a full email hosting service, like competing with Google Workspace or something. But once that got cleared up, the real debate started. On one side, you've got developers who are absolutely thrilled. They're already using Cloudflare Workers. They've got their data in R2, their databases in D1, and now they can add email to that stack without bringing in another vendor. The convenience factor is huge. One user described it as finally being able to build an entire application without leaving the Cloudflare ecosystem. But then, and you knew this was coming, there's the other side of the conversation. And honestly, they raised some pretty valid concerns. User Random Bacon made this really compelling argument about not putting all your eggs in one basket. They said, and I'm paraphrasing here, use different companies for your domain, your DNS, your hosting, and your email. That way, if one provider goes down or goes rogue, you're not completely hosed. And speaking of things going wrong, user Kita shared this horror story about Cloudflare's existing email routing service. Apparently, they had emails just silently failing. No errors, no logs, just emails disappearing into the void. For something as critical as email, that's terrifying. Though to be fair, other users chimed in saying they've been using email routing for years without issues, so your mileage may vary. What really caught my attention, though, is how Cloudflare is framing the future of email. They're not just talking about the traditional use cases. They're looking at AI agents and automated workflows that use email as an input and output mechanism. Think about it. Email is still the universal API that every business understands. You can programmatically send and receive emails to interact with pretty much any company on the planet. In a world of AI agents doing work on our behalf, that's actually incredibly powerful. The technical implementation is pretty clever too. Since it's built into Workers, you get all the benefits of Cloudflare's edge network. Your email sending code runs close to your users, it scales automatically, and it integrates with all their other services. Want to send an email when someone uploads a file to R2? Easy. Need to trigger an email based on a database change in D1? No problem. But here's the thing that really has people divided. Cloudflare is becoming this massive, all-encompassing platform. They started as a CDN, added DNS, then Workers, then storage, databases, and now email. At what point does convenience become concerning? Some commenters pointed out that Cloudflare is essentially becoming critical infrastructure for huge chunks of the internet. If something happens to them, whether it's a technical failure, a policy change, or heaven forbid, some kind of regulatory action, a lot of services could be in trouble. The pricing hasn't been announced yet since it's still in private beta, but that's another big question mark. Transactional email can get expensive at scale, and Cloudflare's track record on pricing is, Well, they've surprised people both positively and negatively in the past. You know what's wild, though? Despite all these concerns, the general sentiment seems cautiously optimistic. Even the skeptics acknowledge that if anyone can make email less painful for developers, it might be Cloudflare. They've got the infrastructure, they've got the developer mindshare, and they've already proven they can take complicated things and make them simple. The private beta is open for signups now, and based on the discussion, a lot of people are eager to try it out. Whether this becomes the next must-have tool in the developer toolkit or another cautionary tale about platform lock-in, well, I guess we'll find out soon enough. And speaking of trying to escape big tech's grasp, let's talk about yet another browser that's promising to be different. Story 5, Helium Browser. All right, so our final story is about Helium Browser, which just lit up Hacker News with over 500 comments, and honestly, the reaction is fascinating because it's equal parts interest and exhaustion. Here's the pitch. Helium is a new desktop browser that's basically declaring war on the modern web's worst habits. No ads, no tracking, no crypto miners, no phishing. They've got uBlock Original baked right in from the start. And here's the kicker. They're claiming no biased exceptions. That's a direct shot at browsers like Chrome and Edge that let certain acceptable ads slip through their filters. You know, those deals where suddenly some ads are deemed okay because, well, money changes hands. What really caught my eye, though, is this claim about 0 web requests on first launch. Think about that for a second. When you fire up Chrome or Edge or even Firefox for the first time, they're immediately phoning home, checking for updates, syncing settings, maybe grabbing some sponsored content for your new tab page. Helium? Nothing. Complete radio silence until you explicitly tell it to connect somewhere. That's actually pretty radical in 2024. But here's where things get interesting, and the Hacker News crowd really dug into this. It's built on Chromium. Yeah, Google's Chromium, the same engine that powers the browser they're essentially rebelling against. And the community is torn on this. On one hand, you've got folks saying, how can you claim to be escaping Google's control when you're literally using their engine? It's like declaring independence while still living in your parents' basement, right? But then there's this developer, Dave DX, who jumps in with a reality check. They're basically saying, look, if you're doing serious front-end development, Chrome's dev tools are irreplaceable. And they've got a point. I mean, how many of us have tried to debug some weird CSS issue in Safari and just given up and opened Chrome? The tools matter, especially for developers, who are probably a big part of Helium's target audience. The transparency issue is another fascinating thread in this discussion. The company behind Helium is registered as a Wyoming LLC, which, if you know anything about Wyoming LLCs, they're basically the Swiss bank accounts of American business entities. Maximum privacy, minimal disclosure requirements. Some users are really uncomfortable with this. They're asking, who's actually building this thing? What's their business model? Because let's be real, browsers are expensive to maintain. You need engineers, you need infrastructure, you need to keep up with web standards that change faster than fashion trends. And that brings us to what I'm calling browser fatigue in the comments. There's this palpable exhaustion with the cycle we've all witnessed. A new browser launches with grand promises about privacy and putting users first. It gains some traction, then reality hits. Bills need to be paid, growth slows down, and suddenly there's a partnership announcement. Before you know it, those uncompromising principles start getting flexible. We've seen it with Opera, we've seen it with Brave to some extent, and users are basically asking, why should Helium be different? NetOpWibby made an interesting observation in the thread, though. They pointed out the irony that the same community getting skeptical about Helium gets genuinely excited about, quote, new Gmail skins. And yeah, that's a fair point about our collective inconsistency. The desktop-only approach is also worth talking about. In an era where everything is mobile first, Helium is completely ignoring phones and tablets. No iOS version, no Android version, just desktop. That's either a huge limitation or a very deliberate choice to focus on power users who actually care about these privacy features. Because, let's be honest, most people browsing on their phones aren't thinking about fingerprinting resistance or crypto miner blocking. They just want their Instagram to load fast. What strikes me most about this whole discussion is that it really highlights where we are with the web right now. We're at this point where a browser that simply doesn't spy on you, doesn't show you ads, and doesn't phone home is considered revolutionary. That's kind of depressing when you think about it. The bar has gotten so low that basic respect for user privacy is now a differentiating feature. Whether Helium can actually deliver on these promises long-term, that's the million-dollar question. Or maybe I should say the $0 question, since they don't seem to have a clear monetization strategy yet. But you know what? Even if they eventually compromise, even if this ends up being another failed experiment in the browser wars, at least they're pushing the conversation forward. They're making other browser makers defend their choices about acceptable ads and default tracking. And sometimes that's worth something. And that's a wrap on yesterday's top stories from Hacker News. What a day, right? From the EU trying to mandate the technically impossible with ChatControl, to Microsoft's convenient amnesia about powering mass surveillance, to private equity literally killing people for profit, and then the ongoing struggle to build tech that actually respects users. Whether that's Cloudflare trying to simplify email or Helium Browser trying to escape the surveillance web. You know what really strikes me about these stories? They're all different facets of the same fundamental tension we're dealing with in tech right now. On one side, we have this incredible potential for technology to empower people, protect privacy, and make life better. On the other, we have powerful forces, governments, corporations, and investors trying to twist that same technology into tools of control, surveillance, and profit extraction. The Hacker News community's response to these stories, over 3,000 comments combined, shows that people aren't just passively accepting this state of affairs. They're angry, they're engaged, and they're demanding better. Whether it's calling out the EU's encryption backdoor fantasy, Microsoft's plausible deniability game, or private equity's deadly healthcare optimization, the tech community is watching, documenting, and pushing back. Will ChatControl get stopped? Will Microsoft face real consequences? Will private equity's healthcare takeover be regulated? Will Cloudflare or Helium actually deliver on their promises? We'll keep tracking these stories as they develop. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive into yesterday's top hacker news stories. If you found this valuable, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss tomorrow's episode. Until then, keep questioning, keep building, and keep fighting for the internet we actually want to see. This has been your Hacker News Daily. I'll see you tomorrow with the next batch of stories that matter.